Them.
Hello, my friends. We are live once again. Fred Hampton Leftists. Tuesdays tend to be more of our foreign policy focused days, and I'm very excited to have probably one of my favorite foreign policy journalists on today. We have Aaron Mate on. Thank you for joining Fred and Leftist, Aaron.
Nick, thanks for having me, man. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. And as leftists, we should always strive to be more educated, debunk U.S. propaganda, because in the U.S., even if you're anti-imperialist, it could be very hard to be an anti-imperialist in this country due to the insane pro-military industrial complex propaganda that we are hit with on a daily basis. Um, it's really tough to know what's true and what's not true, especially in the case of Syria. We even had a lot of progressives getting this issue wrong. So at the Gray Zone, what you guys do, you guys debunk that U.S. pro-war talking points, and that's such a valuable contribution on left. So I appreciate everything you guys do at the Gray Zone. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thanks. And just to speak to the power of that propaganda you're talking about when it comes to manufacturing consent for imperialism, for war. You look at the Gray Zone, you can look at all of us, myself, Max, Ben, our friend Rania too, who's worked for the Gray Zone before. All of us, there have been times when we got Syria wrong. You can look at each of us making statements that where even we got duped. And so it just, it speaks to the power of our propaganda system that even people now who I think have gotten it right and are doing good work around it. There was a time when that wasn't always the case. And so that just there are lessons there for all of us. And it just speaks to how insanely powerful and persuasive our propaganda system can be.
Yeah, because our job is to debunk the pro-imperialist talking points. Like I remember, for one example, like I fought for the old DPRK North Korea propaganda, which is insane. But as you educate yourself, you realize that everything that they tell you about North Korea and a lot of these countries that we're enemies with is not true. And so that's why your focus when you talk about Syria, you taught me a lot. Like I'm gonna be straight up honest, because I used to fall for a lot of that stuff as well. When you hear about the Syrian gas tax, you're like, oh, whoa, what is that? And then I hear about people debunking that. And that's something that was always interesting to me. So we're gonna talk about your latest story regarding Syria. But before we dive into that, for just in case we have any new viewers who are not like 100% caught up to speed on the United States conflict in Syria. Can you do a quick explanation about like the short history of the conflict and why is America, why the United States, why are we so obsessed with getting rid of Assad?
Well, that goes back decades. For a long time, there's been this power struggle in Syria where you have the Ba'ath Party, headed by first by Assad's father and then by Bashar al-Assad after his father died, has been in power for many decades. And their main domestic opponent has been, or I should say, a main domestic opponent, because there are a few, there are different factions, has been the Muslim Brotherhood. And they've been trying to basically seize power for a long time. And that has boiled over into serious violence. Like in the late 70s, there was an attack by the Muslim Brotherhood on Syrian army cadets and a massacre of hundreds of them. Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, his government responded with a brutal attack on the city of Hama, which was the stronghold of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that killed thousands of people. So, and the U.S. has a history of involvement in that. They basically directly and indirectly supported the Muslim Brotherhood, because that's the U.S. playbook, is to, wherever they see a vulnerability for a government that they want to destabilize or overthrow, they will exploit it and they will back the side that is fighting against the government. So fast forward to 2011, you have the Arab Spring protests. And the mainstream narrative of the Arab Spring protests in Syria is that you had this national peaceful uprising against the Syrian government, and that Assad, rather than compromising, waged this brutal, countrywide war on peaceful protesters, a genocidal war, and massacred people. The reality is a lot more nuanced, and nuance is a popular word to use when people are looking to find excuses for imperialism, but not. It's not actually. There's actually not genuine nuance when looking at the actual targets of imperialism and what really happens there. What really happened in 2011 with the protest was that you had different strains. There was a small liberal, leftist segment that people were protesting for reforms, against corruption, more political freedom, things that people like you and I think can support. I mean, very noble aims, calling for basic reforms under an authoritarian government. Those are relatively small. The dominant form of protest in Syria in 2011 during the early stages was sectarian. It was Sunni, large ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were chanting things like Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. And there was a heavy sectarian component to that. And that component was received from very early on support from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and the US. And basically, those protests contained an armed element. And quickly, the protests that happened in early 2011 resulted in armed attacks on Syrian forces. And so that led predictably to violence. And things escalated into this full-blown dirty war where the US and its allies flooded the country with tens of thousands of jihadists from around the world. The CIA, through a program called Timber Sycamore, organized the transfer of weapons to these jihadists. And predictably, the weapons flowed to people like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and similar sectarian death squads to that. While meanwhile, in the US, the picture we were getting was that Assad was just gunning down peaceful protesters. Basically, what he was doing, he was defending his country from an external war of aggression that he didn't start. No matter your criticisms of the Assad government and how they responded to protests, nothing can justify the world's biggest, most richest countries turning Syria, which was a relatively stable country before the war, into a war zone and flooding it with jihadist contras from around the world. So that's basically the short history of the Syria dirty war.
Yeah, and I'm no fan of anyone in the ruling class, no matter what country they're from. But I always tell people, can you imagine the response if there was an uprising in the United States? How brutally and effectively our leaders would take them out. So it's always weird when I see people like, oh, Assad is doing this to people that are trying to overthrow his government. Imagine if we have an armed militia that was trying to overthrow the Biden administration, the wrath that the United States will incur on us. So I always want to put that in that context. And I don't want to judge them for that because obviously you're going with a uprising. Now I want to dive in to your story.
Let me just say, Nick, look at the freak out. Look at the 4-year freak out in this country over Russians posting some memes on social media. I mean, that was compared to Pearl Harbor and the Russians allegedly hacking some emails, which I don't even think Russia did. But even if they did do that, look at the 4-year freak out over that. And, there was declarations that was an act of war. And look at the freak out over a 3-hour riot in the Capitol on January 6th. Compare that to flooding the country with jihadists, like facilitating the transfer of jihadist contras from around the world to enter into Syria, people from all over the world, not Syrians fighting Assad, people from Uzbekistan, the Uyghur region, Europe, North America, and giving them weapons. I mean, the reason Al-Qaeda right now controls the province of Idlib is because Al-Qaeda obtained American tow missiles, anti-tank weapons, and that's what allowed them to take over Idlib. So right now we have an Al-Qaeda province in Syria, what Brett McGurk, who is a senior Biden administration official, has called Al-Qaeda's largest safe haven since 9/11. We have all that thanks to U.S. weapons. And, whatever you feel about Assad, it's irrelevant because no country has the right to do that. And if that happened to, as you say, if that had happened to the U.S. response would have been the exact same. And all these people in the U.S., all these chauvinists who try to, basically support the U.S. line in Syria and accuse the Assad government of all these crimes, all of them would want their government to do the exact same thing. They'd want their government to defeat a foreign-backed dirty war so that their country would not be taken over by extremist militias.
Absolutely. And you guys put back a lot on the Russiagate nonsense. And it literally blows my mind that people push Russiagate despite the fact that the United States have gotten involved in countless elections through the CIA. So there's so much hypocrisy there. And there's so many people that don't realize Assad was fighting terrorists in Syria. And it's shocking to me. Well, I shouldn't say shocking, but not surprising. Not surprising at all. The brazen lies that come from our military industrial complex and what our propagandists can get away with. We have people in the ruling class, we have people in the Pentagon that openly lie about war and the conflict in Syria. So your article that you wrote, this is the title: "To Keep Troops in Syria, the U.S. leaders are lying like they were lying in Afghanistan." So you want to dive into that? What exactly is the giant lie that they are propagating, Aaron?
Well, first of all, just note that Congress never voted for U.S. troops to occupy Syria. Syrians certainly never voted for U.S. troops to occupy their country, but yet hundreds of U.S. troops are there, and it's just completely normalized. We've so internalized our right to occupy foreign countries that the fact that we have stationed hundreds of troops in Syria doesn't even get a debate and doesn't even get very much attention. If you were to ask most Americans, do you know that your government is occupying about 1/3 of Syria right now? I bet you not even a majority might not even know, because it just doesn't get very much attention, because our imperialism has been normalized to the point where it's kind of just like, it's kind of like the air we breathe. We just have the right to do that.
It's a duh. We're gonna get involved in other countries. Like, no, these are sovereign nations that we have. And that's my stance as an anti-imperialist. We should be out. And for example, for Afghanistan, a lot of people are praising Biden. I'm not mad if you're going to praise Biden for decreasing the scale of the war, but they was pretty open about the fact that they are going to continue over-the-air operations, continue airstrikes in Afghanistan, covert operations. So once again, as an anti-imperialist, if I gotta be principled, I think if you're gonna end a conflict, you gotta be out. Like, I don't want to see any CIA investment. I don't want to see over-air operations. But that's just my position as an anti-imperialist. And isn't it true that you have a ton of Syrians that was like protesting the U.S. occupation? So it's not like they even see us as liberators, as the lie they always tend to use to justify U.S. imperialism. Is that true that you have like Syrian resistance to U.S. Occupation there?
I haven't confirmed this myself, but I've heard from people in their reports. I mean, I haven't witnessed it myself, but I've heard from people in their reports, of Syrians protesting the U.S., Syrians in the region of northeast Syria. Certainly, there have been protests in other parts of the country, but even Syrians in the region where the U.S. is occupying in the northeast protesting, because one of the things that the U.S. has done, reportedly, is arrest people who have been instrumental in fighting ISIS, local people who, helped win back their territory from ISIS, which spread thanks to the U.S., which basically created ISIS by going into Iraq. And all the destruction there that led to ISIS. And then we know, by the way, I quote this in the article, there's a clip of John Kerry admitting in a leaked recording that when ISIS was spreading in Syria, the U.S. sat back and watched and was watching ISIS grow. And in Kerry's words, was watching ISIS going to Damascus. And Kerry explained that we thought that this was threatening Assad, and we were willing to let this happen, to let ISIS grow, because we thought that it would put Assad in a threatened position and force him into negotiating, which is basically a euphemism for forcing Assad to negotiate his way out of power. So what Kerry is basically saying was, while we're publicly claiming to fight ISIS and trying to destroy it, we actually were sitting back and watching it grow, and we're letting it grow if that meant we could leverage its growth to oust Assad. So it was more, and he even says the reason Russia came into Syria in 2015. The reason Russia came in, he says, quote, because they didn't want a Daesh government, Daesh being ISIS, right? So that's why Russia came in. And so what Kerry's saying is that the U.S., unlike Russia, was presumably willing to risk a Daesh government if it could mean leveraging that risk to put pressure on Assad and oust the sovereign Syrian government. That's how cynical U.S. policy is. And so,
well, God, what the media will cover this stuff? Like, can you imagine? Like, you always have those like gun-toting conservatives, and where they have this extreme hatred for ISIS. Imagine how little of them actually know that we are complicit with growing ISIS strength in Syria.
Yeah. I mean, the only guy in U.S. political life who said it was Donald Trump when he blurted out that the Obama administration created ISIS, and there was truth to what he was saying. Because the Obama, now, of course, it wasn't just Obama, but it was Bush that launched the Iraq war. But Obama, with his policy in Iraq and then with letting ISIS grow in Syria, there's truth to that. And that's one of the reasons why Trump was vilified by the national security state. It's not that they cared about Trump being a racist or a greedy billionaire and all the other awful things about him. He was a bad steward of the U.S. empire. He said the wrong things. He spoke the truth sometimes. So that's why, that's a big reason why we had Russiagate, is because they just, he was not acceptable to run the show, even when he went along with the empire so many times, repeatedly, to try to, to try to play along. Sometimes his outbursts were just too embarrassing.
Wasn't he on Fox News, and he literally said the quiet part out loud where he was like, "We should be in Syria because we want to take the oil."
Exactly. So to the official the official rationale for U.S. troops being in Syria is that we're there to fight ISIS, and we're there to help train our Kurdish allies in fighting ISIS. But there's a whole bunch of things wrong with that. First of all, as you point out, Trump and other officials have already told the truth. That's not why we're there. Trump said it on Fox News very succinctly. He said, we're there to take the oil. What that means is U.S. officials want to steal Syria's oil, not because the U.S. needs Syria's oil or can do anything with it, really, but because Syria needs its oil to function as a country. And because Syria defeated the U.S. side in the dirty war, so billions of dollars from the CIA and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and all the weapons in the world could not topple the Syrian government. So because that failed, now we have to turn to plan B, which is simply to strangle Syria, make it suffer into submission, make the people suffer for the fact that their government beat the U.S. It's pretty much just sadism, just because the U.S. can do it. And the oil is a big part of that, because without Syria's own oil, it can't provide for its people. It makes it very difficult. And also in that northeast region where the U.S. is staying is also the bulk of Syria's wheat. And so it can't feed its own people. And when I was there in Syria, I saw it. There are bread lines and people are struggling. A big reason for that is because the U.S. is stealing the part of the region that produces their oil and wheat. And there's also these murderous sanctions that prevent Syria from importing food and medicine, all the things that it needs. And so Trump laid it out on the oil when he said that on Fox News. But there's another statement I quote in the article, and this was first discovered by my Grey Zone colleague Ben Norton, from Dana Stroul, who she is now a top senior official under Biden in the Pentagon, running the Middle East for the Pentagon. But before that, in 2019, she was co-chair of something called the Syria Study Group, which basically, for Congress writes up policy reports and policy recommendations for Syria. There's a clip of her, and it's in my article, where she explains basically what the U.S. strategy is. And it's very similar to Trump. She just says it in a more sort of, in the language of a diplomat. But she spells out that the U.S. being in Syria means that the U.S., quote, owned 1/3. Okay, yeah, like you want to play the clip?
I'm gonna get the clip, but let's play this and see what exactly she says. About 2 minutes, but not bad.
The United States
let me make it big
still
here.
had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report. And then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime, so holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians, both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argue that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
What she describing, wouldn't that just help the ordinary average Syrian people? And I find it very interesting how like calm and professional they can just lay out crimes against humanity, because sanctions are a crime against humanity, and they are very open about it, that they want people to starve, they want people to struggle so they can have uprisings against the leaders that the United States want to overthrow. So it's very, very like shocking and bone chilling in a way. Like, you see how professional she is, almost like she's just giving a typical PowerPoint presentation talking about war crimes that you're committing. You have any comment you want to add, Aaron?
Sadism is completely normalized in the State Department. To be a so-called diplomat, you have to be a professional sadist. You have to basically be a sociopath. I mean, look how, as you say, she's so blasé about describing policies that are making millions of people suffer and leading to deaths, shortages. I mean, it's really tough in Syria right now. Hospitals lack vital medicines. If you have cancer, like when I was in Syria, the thing I kept hearing was, if you have some small ailment, you'll be okay. But if you get cancer in Syria, unless you're really, really rich, you can leave and go somewhere else. You're screwed because they can't afford the cancer medicine, like the cancer medicine, and hospitals can't fix the parts for their machines. And then you have this person in Washington who none of these Syrians have ever voted for. I mean, no Syrians voted for Dana Stroul and her colleagues in the State Department. But yet these are the people in Washington whose decisions, like the stroke of their pen lead to consequences of life and death for millions of Syrians. And here they are just nonchalantly bragging about it, how they can hold a card on reconstruction, prevent Syria from rebuilding, and how we own 1/3 of Syria. I mean, it's the language of a mafia don and of a dictator. And it's completely normalized.
Yeah, that is what they would have us believe about Russians. They would say Russians, like, there's like a new wave of xenophobia on Russians that is somehow like socially acceptable. Because Russia essentially is xenophobia in a nutshell. The belief that Russians are inherently evil and they don't care about human life. Like there was a lot of stories in liberal media, like just straight up like, oh, stay in Russian country. They don't really care about people's lives. But meanwhile, the Russians that were trying to improve infrastructure in Syria, which will improve Syrian lives, while the United States is fighting against that. That's just a very interesting dynamic, and why I never ever buy the U.S. propaganda. I do want to quickly get to the super chat, and then we get right back to Syria. This is from Danny. Thank you for the super chat, Danny. I think this is pretty relevant what we were talking about, because has Aaron gotten an apology from TYT in private or public after the BBC's apology essentially proved his coverage of the Syrian conflict as correct? So did the BBC actually? I didn't hear about that. So they didn't have an apology about their Syria coverage. Do you want to expand on that?
I think Danny's being a little bit too generous to the BBC or to me here, because the BBC's apology was very limited. The BBC. So first of all, I'll never get an apology from TYT, aka the middle-aged McCarthyites, because they're like. But again, it doesn't matter. They're clowns. Like, and I think this whole episode really showed that. I honestly look at them as more just like they're a comedy duo now. They're funny. Like, they make me laugh. It's like, I imagine they're doing a bit of what like a progressive news duo looks like. It's like, it's funny to me. So it's like, I don't expect an apology from them, because I just don't think they have any connection to reality whatsoever. So they couldn't bring themselves, no matter how many times they get caught lying about me or Jimmy Dore, to apologize. That will never happen. But it's certainly this BBC thing. The BBC issued a narrow apology. They only retracted a couple of claims that they made, whereas I've cataloged a very long list of errors, omissions, innuendo that the BBC did, and this was in a podcast that they put out, basically trying to whitewash the Syria dirty war, and specifically trying to whitewash the OPCW cover-up scandal, this alleged chemical attack in Douma, Syria, which led to U.S. bombings. What I've reported on extensively is that the actual OPCW inspectors who went to Syria found no evidence of a chemical attack, but they were censored. Their reports were doctored, and they were sidelined in basically a widespread cover-up under U.S. pressure. So the BBC whitewashed this scandal. And they also whitewashed the White Helmets, which is this. They're officially known as a rescue group funded by the US, UK, and all the other belligerents in the Syria dirty war. What they really are is a propaganda tool that was directly involved in things like the staged Douma incident. So this BBC podcast goes to a lot of effort to whitewash the OPCW scandal, to attack the whistleblowers, and to portray the White Helmets as just the victims of a Russian disinformation campaign. And they were challenged on a couple of their claims by Peter Hitchens, who's a British journalist. And the BBC actually ruled in his favor, and they apologized for it. But as I've said before, that only scratches the surface of the mistakes that they made and the lies they told. So no, certainly even the apology from the BBC doesn't even begin to address what they need to account for.
Yeah, Gene also brings up a great point. Aaron has had to put up with public smearing, being called a supporter of dictators by pretend leftists. That's a great way to put them. I like to call them CIA leftists, and that's what happens when you challenge the imperialist propaganda for the United States. And I've been calling out these CIA leftists for a long time because these people, they will advocate for stuff like healthcare, $15 minimum wage, canceling student loan debt, for example. But anything outside of our borders, they don't care about. They'll just repeat the CIA talking point. And if you know the entire history of the CIA, if you don't know the history of the CIA, you barely know American history. Like you got a very surface level idea of that. If you're just repeating CIA talking points and you're doing that repeatedly, can you really call yourself a leftist? I'll leave that question to you guys.
Yeah, and to me, it's not that this trend wasn't happening before Russiagate, but Russiagate made it a lot worse because all of a sudden, who are we supposed to worship and deem to be the answer to Donald J. Trump? It was the CIA and the FBI. They were our heroes. There was recently an article in the New York Times interviewing an FBI whistleblower who came forward with with accounts of how the FBI was framing people and wrongfully arresting people. And the New York Times notes that he came out during Russiagate at a time when liberals were wary of criticizing the FBI, So that's Russiagate really accelerated this effort to make people march in lockstep with the national security state, the very same forces that have been attacking progressive values both at home and around the world for a long time. And yeah, we have a real problem with chauvinism on the left, where people can support good things at home, healthcare for all, education, but as soon as you try to apply the same values to overseas, they turn on you. And that in the case of the Young Turks, they accuse you of working for foreign governments and all this bullshit like that. It's a problem. It's a problem. And it's funny. It's crazy how successful it's been because look at how many people have been intimidated to not even talking about Syria. I mean, certain people have gone so far as to smear people like me, say I'm working for dictators and all that. But a lot of other people have just been intimidated, I think, by these attacks to just not go there, because you get the message that if you touch certain subjects, if you touch Syria, if you touch Xinjiang in China, all these things that have been declared to be like sacrosanct, you can't question them, you're going to face smears. And for a lot of people, that's enough just to make them decide, whether consciously or not, that they don't have the energy to go there. So they're going to focus on more safe things. And that's a problem because it means that not a lot of people hear about the most important issues that they should be concerned about, like war and imperialism.
Yeah, we all heard the Assad worshippers smear all over again. That's the smear that Anna Kasparian was repeating, and it's so ridiculous to me that leftists are repeating the same U.S. imperialist propaganda strategy. Because if you was around during the War on Terror, debunking the War on Terror, they will be calling you a Saddam Hussein apologist. This is a long time strategy, so it's very interesting to see so many people on the left fall for that and continue to propagate that. And I mentioned earlier before, being an anti-imperialist in this country is really hard. And even the so-called quote unquote progressive outlets get things wrong. So you may be watching TYT, you may be reading The Intercept, and you might think you're like, oh, I'm getting some great information on this subject. I know you had some criticisms of The Intercept's coverage on Syria. And I used to read The Intercept a lot. Like they played a big role in helping me become a leftist. But I've seen them get a lot of things wrong recently, especially the Syria thing. That what kind of woke me up a lot. For people who don't know, what is your criticism of how The Intercept covers Syria? If you want to dive into that,
they've been pro dirty war. There's just no other way to put it. If you look at all their coverage of Syria, it's awful. Occasionally, they'll try to make up for it with something that's not horrible, but for the most part, they've been whitewashing all the propaganda used to sustain the dirty war. It's The Intercept is basically a parody of what a genuine adversarial site should be when it comes to foreign policy. On domestic policy, going back to what we were saying before, they're pretty good. I think they do really good stuff. But when it comes to foreign policy, they've been complete dupes on all the issues where they need to have some courage, like Syria, China, and Russiagate too. I mean, on Russiagate, except for Glenn Greenwald, they were a pro-Russiagate outlet. It's a farce, and it's so funny that with something like Russiagate, which is so stupid and such a transparent scam, and so full of holes that were very easy to identify, as I spent a lot of time doing for 4 years. The Intercept was run by people who were so desperate to fit in with sort of like mainstream liberal culture that they just were willing to go along with it on something as dumb as Russiagate. On Syria, you can say it's a little bit more complicated, although really it's not. But whatever. Russiagate was just such a scam, and they went to great lengths to go along with it. I mean, that's starting with their editor-in-chief Betsy Reed to all the other editors there, and that's what ultimately basically led to Glenn Greenwald's departure. Is because when he tried to challenge an outgrowth of Russiagate, which was this Hunter Biden laptop story and the claims that it's Russian, it's all the work of Russia, he was censored. So he had to leave. So The Intercept's a sad example of just how powerful our propaganda system is, that even this adversarial site that's supposed to be challenging the national security state can be duped and coerced into propping it up. And they've certainly done that with Syria. I mean, just looking at this OPCW story, where again, so April 2018, Syria gets accused of a chemical attack in Douma. The US, Britain, and France bomb Syria. Around that time, The Intercept ran several articles basically promoting the Trump administration line that Assad was guilty of a chemical weapons attack. At least 5, I think, by my count. And so that's April 2018. Now, fast forward about a year, just over a year later, we start getting leaks from the OPCW showing that the OPCW team that went to Syria actually undermined the allegation completely. It found no evidence of a chemical attack and that they were censored from above. Okay, huge scandal. The Intercept has covered the OPCW leaks 0 times, has not even acknowledged the existence of these brave OPCW inspectors.
Still to this day?
Still to this day. So
wow.
So the leaks have been out now in the public eye for more than 2 years. And you can go to the Intercept's website. You will not find these whistleblowers or their leaks, the trove of documents that have come out showing this deception at the OPCW. They have not even acknowledged the existence of any of that. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, that's very damning.
Yeah,
to me, because and that's kind of why I got into this media sphere. I wanted to help correct the record on the constant propaganda that goes on, because I'm very critical of the Biden administration, but I didn't have a platform back then. A lot of people don't realize I was just as critical of Donald Trump during his early days, and I was watching everything Trump did like a hawk, mostly because I'm a nerd, especially a foreign policy nerd. I love looking into that stuff. So when I heard the Russiagate story when it first started, I honestly tried to look into it with an open mind. But as things kept going, I'm like, Donald Trump is one of the most anti-Russian presidents since Bill Clinton. He pulled out the nuclear arms treaty. He supported the coup in Venezuela, which was directly against Russia's interests. We literally just point out how they was taking the opposing side in Russia and in Syria. So when you actually pay, they were arming Ukrainian rebels. Like, there's so many different examples and I was seeing this stuff going on. I'm like, wait, what? Like, how does it make sense that Trump is supposed to be a Russian puppet when he's opposing Putin on so many global political issues? So, and then when I see people that were smarter than me, but like definitely smarter than me, especially before I was in this game and they was getting it wrong, that really was a shock to my system. That's why I'm like, I got to do something. And that's eventually I got my platform because I wanted to correct those misinformation that was coming out from a lot of people that I used to respect. Like I said, I used to read the Intercept a lot. And that's the kind of stuff that made me like skeptical of them. And I acknowledge, like you did, that they could do good domestic reporting. But this is the problem. Like when you are that wrong and when you're that intellectually bankrupt, where you're not even to cover the OPCW scandal, that makes me question so many things. Even if you do good work, that's just a blow to your credibility that's hard to come back from. I got a super chat. Do you know what they're talking about here? Aaron, it said, does Aaron have his Russian blanket nearby? Can we see? I don't know what that's about.
That's a reference to Cenk, who.
Okay.
I mean, if you watch that video, it's just funny. It's comedy. That's why it's like I was mad about it for a bit because they slandered me, but eventually it's hard to be mad at because they're just such clowns that how can you be that mad at a clown? You know, and so he accuses me of having a Russian blanket, and he does this stupid thing. I mean, it's just it's funny. It's hard to stay mad at. And look, they actually, I have to give them credit. They did me a favor, really, ultimately, because the media has worked so hard to ignore the OPCW scandal because it's so damning in so many ways. It shows that, first of all, this allegation that Assad just gasses his own people for the fun of it because he's a genocidal maniac, and that magically these gas attacks always manage to only hit civilians. He never does it against the rebels who are conquering territory from him. So it's very lucky for the rebels. This scenario that makes no sense, that Assad's been committing these chemical attacks. And by the way, he's also doing it even though he knows it will invite U.S. military intervention. I mean, it's just such a ridiculous, even if you knew none of the evidence, the allegation is so ridiculous on its face. But this allegation has been so foundational to the propaganda used to sustain the dirty war, to justify the U.S. military being there and occupying Syria, stealing its oil and wheat, and to maintain these crippling sanctions because they say we have to, stand up to this dictator using chemical weapons. So this Duma scandal exposes that to be a fraud. It also exposes that it was done with the complicity of the White Helmets, which is a U.S., UK funded organization that's portrayed in the U.S., including by outlets like The Intercept, as like humanitarian heroes. And then it shows a deception, not just in Duma to stage all this, but then a deception at the OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, to cover all of this up, to silence its own inspectors, to basically justify pro-war actions by the U.S., pro-war propaganda and actual warfare, the U.S. bombing Syria with its allies. So it's a major scandal. So a U.S. media that does not see itself as actual, safeguards against wrongdoing and as trying to, stand up to the powerful, but as stenographers for the U.S. war machine, including in this case, The Intercept, this story is so damning to all the narratives that they've bought into and promoted. So that's why they have to ignore it. So the Young Turks, when they came along and slandered me, they helped bring this OPCW scandal back. They gave it some attention, which is great because when you actually look at the facts, they're so overwhelming that nobody can challenge them. And I say this not to sound cocky, but just to point out how overwhelming the facts are. I've written something now like 12 articles on this scandal, and I have sources. So I have leaked documents that show what happened, and no one can refute them. No one can refute what I've written because the facts are so overwhelming. So that's why when the Young Turks, did this thing against me, they did me a favor by helping bring some attention to a scandal that everybody else was trying to ignore. And by the way, that also includes Democracy Now, which taught me. I worked for 10 years, taught me so much about journalism. Even before I worked there, it was an inspirational show for me. Their only coverage of the OPCW scandal was very early on when it first materialized, and they brought on a guy who's a pro-dirty war apologist to whitewash the scandal, to downplay it. And later on, this guy, his name is Brian Whitaker, he doxed one of the whistleblowers. And Democracy Now! Has not revisited the issue since. They've also ignored it. So not because I think that they're corrupt or been bought off, but because dirty war propaganda is very powerful, and people have a hard time admitting when they're wrong. It's bad for their brand. But in this case, the complicity here it goes across the spectrum from the corporate media to our biggest progressive media sites like Democracy Now! And The Intercept.
I'm actually really sad that I missed Democracy Now! During like his when they were at their best, when they were really challenging George Bush in the Iraq War. Because once again, I missed them when they was at their best. I seen clips and that kind of helped educate me, but I wasn't a frequent viewer. I remember I tried. I heard like, oh, Democracy Now! Is like this great show to watch if you're a leftist anti-imperialist. I watched them recently, and I'm like, yo, they kind of. And this was during the Trump era. That's when I started watching them more. And I'm like, yo, they're kind of the same. They're repeating RussiaGate. Like I didn't understand the hype, but then I learned later that they just dropped the ball, and Amy Goodman is not what she used to be. And once again, this comes from a lot of people who used to respect her. And I'm kind of mad that I missed when Democracy Now! Was doing really great work. With the TYT thing, I found it funny because I always, with that whole scandal, I always want to make sure I redirect it to the issues, because when that whole thing went off, they were so desperate to redirect it to everything else, where Anna will bring up Jimmy or whatever. And I'm like, no.
Yeah, she concocted. She tried to Me Too him, and it failed. It was like one of the very few failed Me Too's because it was so ridiculous. Her and Cenk were telling contradictory stories. They weren't even telling the same story about what Jimmy allegedly did. It was such a joke.
Yeah, and they did that to redirect the fact that they smeared a journalist and they was lying about Syria in the process. And I'm like, so whenever someone tried to do that, like, no, wait, no, get back. TYT smeared a journalist, and that's what them and their sycophants always did. The last thing I want to bring up, I've been following Natalie Bennett and what's going on in Israel. We got the Biden administration that is effectively funding the genocide, giving them weapon deals while they're still bombing Gaza. They recently met, Naftali Bennett and Joe Biden. And one thing that was very shocking, well, not shocking because it's to be expected, because Naftali Bennett has been to the right of even Netanyahu and some things that he said, where he said we should straight up purge the Gaza Strip, and that's why they're bombing it now. Even Netanyahu didn't go that far, to my knowledge. But he recently had a conversation with Biden where he wanted Biden to stay in Syria, he wanted him to stay in Iraq. And I'll cover the Iran and how the U.S. is increasing tension with Iran, because this was just another like failed campaign promise. I remember I heard all the time how Biden, like, we're going to get back into the Iran deal. We're going to get back into the Iran deal. Where are we? we haven't did that. We continued the sanctions. You have even the Iran foreign ministers that were saying, when you look at the foreign policy of Joe Biden, it's literally the exact same strategy of Donald Trump. We have a hardline stance against Iran. And now you have Natalie Bennett that wants them to continue their presence in Syria. So do you want to expand on that, Aaron? Why is Israel so interested in keeping the United States in this conflict?
Yeah, I think a major motivator for the Syria dirty war is that Syria is a part of the axis of resistance. So Syria supports Hezbollah and Iran, and mainly in fighting back against Israel. And Iran and Hezbollah have the capacity to do that. And Hezbollah has shown before that it can defeat Israel militarily, that Israel, it's used to smashing people as smithereens because it has the backing of the U.S. and all the U.S. weapons in the world. But Hezbollah has repeatedly humiliated Israel. So that's a problem for U.S. and Israeli hegemony in the region. So I think a major factor for the Syria dirty war was that the U.S. and Israel and their allies wanted to smash a country that has been a hub for resistance against the U.S. and Israel. That's really what motivates also decades of U.S. policy towards Iran. Iran acts as a curb on U.S. and Israeli aggression in the region. So I think the Syria dirty war was a way to basically destroy a state that is a part of the axis of resistance. And if it couldn't even destroy Syria completely, at least it could bleed Iran, just as like the U.S. used Afghanistan to bleed the Soviet Union back in the 1980s. I mean, that I think was a part of the cynical strategy here. There's a lot of speculation for what the motives were, and they're complicated depending on which country it is, whether it's Saudi Arabia and Qatar had other motives, I think, Turkey had other motives. But for the U.S. and Israel, I think the primary motive was to smash a place that is a center for resistance against U.S. and Israel, and to bleed Iran and Hezbollah. And they've been successful at that because, predictably, when you're fighting a war, when you're flooding Syria, which borders Lebanon, so it borders where Lebanon is, it's also close to Iran. When you're basically flooding the country with jihadists, Sunni jihadists that want to destroy Iran, want to kill Shia, predictably, Iran is going to fight back, and going to fight back to defend one of its closest allies. So Iran entered the war, and it spent a lot of resources on it and lost a lot of people. And Israel basically wants to see that just continue. There's no security threat to Israel from Syria. They've been, Syria lost territory from Israel in 1967. Israel stole what became the Golan Heights. But Syria has tried to negotiate peace agreements with Israel because, Syria just wants its land back. It doesn't want to engage in a war with Israel because it can't win a war with Israel. But what Israel wants to do is basically use its military power to basically bleed its allies. And that's why I think you have now Bennett asking Biden to keep U.S. troops in Syria, because he wants to see Iran continue to be involved there, and he wants to be able to use that to continue to launch attacks on Iran inside Syria. Because it's another fact we haven't discussed that doesn't get discussed in the U.S. media. We talked about how the fact that we have hundreds of U.S. troops there and how that's barely reported. Another barely reported fact is that Israel just bombs Syria all the time. And it's become so normalized that the U.S. media barely reports it. But there have been hundreds of Israeli strikes on Syria going back the many years of the dirty war. And it's continuing today. So when Iran tries to break the blockade of Syria, the U.S. imposed blockade, by importing fuel that Syrians need to live their lives, Israel bombs the ships. And we're also just supposed to all just look away and pretend that's all normal because we've so internalized our self-declared right to commit violence against anybody we want to overthrow and destabilize. So those, I think, to me, are the main converging Israeli-U.S. interests behind the dirty war in Syria.
Yeah, well said. I love the facts that you bring to the conversations because you do a really good job at debunking the propaganda. So I appreciate you coming on for Hampton Leftists. Make sure you gotta check out the full story where Aaron Mate lays out how the Biden administration, the military-industrial complex, is lying about Syria. There's so much to learn, and as leftists, I mentioned this earlier on today. It's what we can do. We gotta continue to educate ourselves. We gotta look at multiple sources because there's so much propaganda, even from outlets that could be progressive on domestic issues. So make sure you got to check out the Gray Zone because they do really good work. And there's a reason why you see the establishment constantly smearing them, because they do not take kindly to anyone who pushes back against the U.S. imperialist narrative. So make sure you got to check out that Substack. Is there any last word anything you want to leave the audience with, Aaron? Anything that you want to plug before we wrap up here?
No, listen, Nick, I'm grateful that you had me on, and you mentioned, coming into the media space relatively recently. I'm just grateful you're here because, the Russiagate era showed us that there's just a lot of people who put being accepted by the mainstream over real politics and building a real future that we all want, and standing by our values, which are just, basic progressive values, in my opinion, just basic leftist stuff. A lot of people sold that out to drink the Kool-Aid on Russiagate. So there's a huge void to fill in media right now. And I'm really happy to see sort of this growing community of people who are trying to fill it. And I love what you guys do at Hampton Leftists. So thanks for having me on. Yeah,
absolutely. I appreciate that, Aaron. And thank you for everyone who watched today. We upload every day, so make sure you hit the bell, leave a like, and share if you enjoyed this discussion. I usually try and focus on state violence, foreign policy, and the class war. We want to keep it very substantive here at Hampton Leftists. So hopefully you guys enjoy this and show support on FredHamptonLeftist.com if you enjoyed this video. I will also be on the Jimmy Dore Show today, so make sure you guys check that out. That should be very fun. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. This is Social Cinema, Aaron Mate, sign out. Thank you guys.